Good morning to you all. I would like to thank LafargeHolcim for this invitation and the opportunity of sharing with you some views about Africa's infrastructure appetite. It would be presumptuous to me to tell you about the importance of infrastructure, a subject that I believe you all have more expertise than myself. Suffice to say that we all know the importance of infrastructure in fostering growth and development, two important issues for Africa. And indeed, Africa, because it lags behind other regions on almost all infrastructure indicators, deserves to give high visibility to such a topical discussion. Accelerating infrastructure development is not only essential to maintain the current growth trajectory of the continent, but also a prerequisite for preparing the continent for major megatrends I will mention later. Deficits in roads, railways, ports, airports, information and communication technology, to mention a few, as well as energy, are really daunting. It is estimated that in Africa, these deficits hamper national economic growth by 2 percentage points every year and cut business productivity by as much as 40%. Lack of proper infrastructure is a serious bottleneck for private business. Transport costs, for example, remain uncompetitive in Africa compared to other regions. Freight costs account for 13% of the value of imports in Africa, against an average of about 8.8% for the rest of developing countries and about 5.2% for industrialized countries. It is more expensive to get a container from the port of Mombasa to Kigali in Rwanda than it is to get that same container from China all the way to Mombasa. Against this background, nobody will be surprised that the African leadership is so focused on the need for large investments in the sector, despite the challenging global economic landscape. In fact, in Africa, the picture looks like this. A number of mega initiatives are driving the discussion at the continent level. There are 2 big programs that have been adopted by the African leadership through the African Union. The Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, PIDA, and the Presidential Infrastructure Champions Initiative, PICI, both of them the subject of a lot of follow-ups in every discussion that is taking place these days in Africa, and both of them concentrating on strategic continent-wide impactful projects. Let me mention, for instance, the 23.7 billion natural gas pipeline from Nigeria to Algeria, and then from Algeria to Spain. 8,715-kilometer road rail transport corridor all the way from Dakar to Djibouti, linking the largest horizontal west to east stretch of the continent, estimated to cost about 18 billion. The construction of a multi-nodal roads, railways and ports, transcontinental interconnector that will ultimately link Cape Town in the extreme south to Cairo in the north. The construction of a navigation line between Lake Victoria and the Mediterranean Sea to enable intermodal transport by integrating river, rail, and road transport along a Nile corridor. The Lapset corridor that will connect Kenya's Lamu port to South Sudan and Ethiopia. Or a high-speed standard gauge modern railway from the Kenya's port of Mombasa to Kigali in Rwanda and Juba in South Sudan. In the field of power projects, 2 examples stand out. First, Ethiopia's Grand Renaissance Dam, a project that will develop 5,250 megawatts of hydropower in the Nile Basin. It will be Africa's largest hydroelectrical power plant with a storage capacity of 7,000 billion cubic meters of water. Second, the Zambia-Tanzania-Kenya interconnector project that will integrate these three countries into one single grid covering a distance of over 2,000 kilometers. Africa is also embarking on a major renewable energy initiative in the order of 70 billion to add 10 gigawatts of electricity capacity by 2020 and at least 300 gigawatts by 2030. Several countries are also driving their own ambitious plans. Between 2010 and 2014, Cape Verde increased its renewable power capacity by 200%, mainly from wind and solar. South Africa, between 2011 and 2015, invested 190 billion rand to add 6.3 gigawatts of renewable energy to its energy mix. Morocco increased its renewable energy installed capacity by roughly 24% over the same period. Mauritania installed 15 megawatts of solar PV plants in 2013 and is planning to install another 12 megawatts by the end of this year in collaboration with Masdar of the United Arab Emirates. Kenya now ranks as the third country in the world with installed geothermal power capacity at approximately 600 megawatts. And Ethiopia is also building a wind farm in Adama with 153 megawatts, now the largest wind project in the continent. Many more initiatives are taking off. That is more or less the picture that we are seeing in the continent. More investments on infrastructure in the last 5 years than in the previous 30. The financial implications of what is the largest drive for infrastructure so far are substantial. So it's normal for people to ask whether Africa has the money for all of this. The financing gap is huge, and the need for additional resources unquestionable. Between now and 2020, Africa will need about $93 billion annually to overhaul just its current infrastructure. About two-thirds, or 60 billion, will serve for building and about 30 billion for operation and maintenance. These financial needs represent about 10% of Africa's middle-income countries' GDP, or if we prefer, 15% of its low-middle-income countries. The shortfall to meet this desired target is therefore quite substantial. However, it only represents, if we see it from a different angle, between 1 and 2% of Africa's fiscal pressure. 1 and 2% of Africa's fiscal pressure. Contrary to popular belief, domestic financing remains the single main source of infrastructure financing in Africa. Recent estimates suggest that Africa finances about 65% of its infrastructure expenditure. Resources have increased thanks to better revenue collection, gains from a commodity price boom, and more generally improved macroeconomic and institutional policies. Africa has the potential to generate significantly more domestic financial resources. Its fiscal pressure is the lowest in the world at about 17% for a world average of over 35%. For instance, by simply improving internal tax efficiencies, Africa has the potential to generate more domestic resources. It is known that African governments have a weak capacity to collect taxes. Although tax revenues are the largest source of domestic resources, many African countries have a tax-to-GDP ratio below 10%. Mobilizing alternative sources of investment will first have to start here. Then we can go into private equity, pension funds, and sovereign funds that have all potential to generate significant sources for local investment if they are better managed. By the end of 2014, just to give you an idea, private equity firms were estimated to have assets worth 25 billion in Africa, which may seem a lot, but is actually very little. The size of Africa's pension funds, just in comparison, is growing at an impressive pace. For instance, South Africa saw assets grow from $166 billion in 2007 to $277 billion this year. Nigeria, from $3 billion in 2008 to $14 billion in 2010. I don't have figures more recent for Nigeria. So we see the potential of the pension funds as quite unique and extremely important for the future. Boosting regional integration and the establishment of a continental free trade area, a discussion that is taking place right now and is supposed to come to an agreement by next year, will have significant contribution for the increase of domestic resource base. Curtailing illicit financial flows will also free up capital for infrastructure projects. In a recent data that collected by my organization shows that annual average illicit financial flows out of the continent is reaching between $50 and $60 billion a year. I'm not saying all of this to paint an optimistic picture about Africa's financing capabilities. I'm just saying that a lot more is possible. Someone mentioned in the previous interventions the Suez Canal. The second Suez Canal was funded completely by a subscription that was launched to the citizens of Egypt. And in about 6 months, the government managed to collect $9 billion. Africa still needs foreign domestic investment, though. But I'm conscious that avenue is not an easy one, because such investments are long-term and based on return calculations that are much more complex and require financial engineering that has proven very difficult for Africans to master. For these types of investments, stability, of course, is a must. Foreign investors are normally worried about investing in Africa or any frontier market. And the perception is that Africa is a risky place to invest, and a continent in constant conflict and crisis. However, the news are not as bad as most think. My number one job is actually to demonstrate that these perceptions about Africa are wrong. Let me pick out a few narratives that are misconstrued. Let me start with the current negativism on Africa's prospects due to the falling commodity prices. The Africa Rising narrative has dominated the coverage until quite recently, when falling commodity prices and recessive demand from large economies like China, coupled with currency volatility, have yet again raised alarm bells. Low commodity prices in particular are causing lower export revenues, fiscal imbalances, and current account deficits across several African countries. In 2015, Africa had the highest negative current account balance over the last 10 years. African countries remain exposed to volatility and trade shocks as a result of their dependence on commodity and natural resources exports. However, taken in context, the current volatility of most commodities, oil excluded, is not out of the ordinary when compared to past trends. Most African countries are actually net importers of commodities and are therefore set to gain from lower prices. A recent drop of the oil prices to around 30 per barrel is estimated to have costed oil exporting countries in Africa about 47 billion in trade losses. However, this represents only 8% of Africa's total value exports in last year. Whilst it is difficult to predict how the current downturn in commodity prices will affect Africa's overall development trajectory, let's keep in mind that other commodities such as uranium, gold, coffee, cocoa, or even orange juice exported from Africa in big quantities are experiencing record prices. Equally, fall in oil prices present good incentives for governments to relocate economic resources away from commodity production into more diversified economies and cut on subsidies that were a pervasive problem in most African economies. So therefore, the picture is not as bad as it looks. The second issue I would like to comment on is the supposition that Africa's debt is reaching unsustainable levels. Africa's total foreign debt has been higher than 30% of GDP since 2010, and it was projected to have risen to about 37% ratio to GDP by the end of last year. However, if you take into account the net foreign debt as a share of GDP, which is the one that we calculate taking into account foreign reserves, the actual debt of Africa is about 1%. And in fact, it was negative since 2006, and it turned just 1% bad for Africa last year. This debt level is absolutely comparable to other developing countries and is well below that of advanced economies, as we know. For example, the total debt for OECD countries was nearly 80% of OECD GDP in 2008, but what is more interesting is since that crisis, it has grown to 111.2% by the end of last year. So you see there is an increase that is not commensurate to what I just described for Africa. As of mid last year, Africa's public debt to GDP is still lower than in decades and overall fiscal policies of the continent. The debt level is also comparable to more advanced economies that are doing well. And as of 2014, 35 out of 42 African countries with data had reserves that would double what they had in external debt. In similar fashion, in the year previous, 2014, 40 of the 46 African countries with data had external debt to GNI ratios lower than 50%. So that would be dreamland for most of European countries. Part of the challenge is that there is no coherent mechanism to govern any future sovereign debt crisis, and this overshadows what should be an important debate on quantitative easing that was used first in the US and now it's being used by the European Central Bank, that have created easy credit for debilitated economies of developed countries, and that has not really changed most of that situation since 2008, 2009. Despite quantitative easing, their economies have contracted by about 54%. Someone has to pay for this disaster, and part of it is this discourse about debt. The discourse on debt should be, therefore, contextualized, giving African countries the flexibility in placing debt ceilings without unduly burdening their fiscal stance, as it has been the case in the last 15 years. The third area that investors harp on about is the perception of security and conflict. Perceptions of a continent completely linked to conflict persist, despite facts calling for a more nuanced view. Between 2014 and 2015, armed conflicts decreased by 14%, the first negative trend since 2009. Conflict-related fatalities dropped by 10%, and confrontations between armed groups comprised only 1/4 of all these conflict events. Patterns of conflict across the continent are changing, and that should mitigate the perceptions of a conflict-prone continent. While overall political violence seemed to decrease, civil wars, armed insurgencies, and violence against civilians remain a major source of instability, but now concentrated on a few countries. In Asia, almost a third more people are killed by conflicts than in Africa. But the UN Security Council continued to make Africa's conflicts an active part of their agenda but they don't include in their agenda the conflicts in Ukraine, or Colombia, or Malaysia, or Philippines, or Indonesia, or India, Thailand, or Myanmar. Neither do we see a military foreign mission to tackle the piracy of the Strait of Malacca, bordering Malaysia and Singapore, despite having twice more number of attacks than the Somali coast. These negative headlines create a gap between perceptions and reality regarding the investment climate in Africa, despite the fact that consistently over the last few years, over half of the fastest 10 growing economies are from Africa, and the continent ranks as the fastest growing continent and the second most attractive investment destination according to Ernst & Young. The prevailing narrative is all about problems. It is important that we contextualize risks, understanding what the reality is and what is an externally driven perception, so that Africa is not shortchanged. In fact, current megatrends are in Africa's favor, be it the demographic boom, the rising middle class, rapid urbanization, and the potential for leapfrogging many fronts, including renewable energy. I hope I managed to do a good job of better showing the continent's opportunities. A continent where the state of the economy offers some of the best prospects for the future, but more precisely, a continent where the need for development of innovative and sustainable infrastructure systems is the most acute in the whole world. I thank you.